Hey guys, I thought I'd share a little info with you. I had a conversation with someone today and they posed a question to me, a kind of interesting question and actually kind of a loaded question. They asked me what the difference was between a Windows role and a Windows feature. That's kind of hard to answer, and I did struggle with it a bit. Not because I don't know, but because there's too many answers. For example, I'm looking at a Server 2012 desktop, obviously, and I have my normal management stuff here. Of course, 2012 is a little different, but 80% of it is recognizable to anybody who's used a Microsoft operating system in the past 5 years. So, but if we're thinking about the difference between roles and features, I kind of look at it this way. For example, look at this. I'm obviously looking at my server through a remote desktop session, which is, other than PowerShell, it's the way Microsoft wants you to manage your servers now. And they've done a little upgrade to the remote desktop client. And what that little upgrade does is add some compatibility to the Windows 8 interface that Server 2012 has inherited. If you click up here in the title bar of your remote desktop connection window, just right-click it, you're going to see a new little set of commands here. So we have app commands, charm, snap, switch app, start. These mimic what you would be able to do with a touchscreen command or a keyboard shortcut where you actually at the console, which is kind of neat. For example, if I go to app commands, I should be able to see my apps, but of course I didn't see them because it's a Microsoft product. However, I know if I click start, I will see another feature. Oh, well, here's another way to think about it. And it kind of occurred to me after I had already left the individual I was talking to. Let's see. Roles and features. Well, my role as a Windows system administrator is really not enhanced by the Windows 8 Metro/Tile interface feature. In fact, it's kind of in the way and pointless. However, this functionality, this is a feature. Let's click on the feature of going back to our desktop. Okay, it's kind of a joke, but it's easy to remember. My role is the administrator. Features are supposed to make whatever I'm using to perform my role easier. So, let's take a little closer look here. One of the things you have to remember about Microsoft is they have a tendency to overload their terminology, which means depending on the context you're in, a word can have a completely different meaning. For example, most of us who have been doing Windows administration for a while are familiar with Active Directory and the concept of what's called the Flexible Single Master Operation, FSMO, role. Now, if you go back as far as I do, back to, say, the days of NT4, pre-Active Directory, a server role was nothing more than, was it a primary or backup domain controller? That was pretty much it. That was the role. There wasn't any application-specific roles going on, nothing like that. There weren't any duties that were really shared or done between servers. It was, you had the primary and everything else basically was a read-only copy of that. Maybe you could make something the browser master, or the master browser. So what? Well, it's not, that's kind of a role. I guess that would be a role, but it was never called one. If you remember the FSMO roles that came along in Windows 2000 when Active Directory came around, then you're familiar with the concept of a directory database and of different roles. There's five primary roles for Active Directory. 5 flexible single master operation roles. Okay, now this is probably the most missed question on any Microsoft certification exam, so hey, I'm going to take a little time and go through them a little bit. Remember, these are roles. And remember, the roles in this context now mean this is what your server, one of its primary functions are. This is what it is meant to do. For example, probably the most benignly named but important roles you'll have in an Active Directory domain is the PDC emulator. The PDC emulator, we'll keep it short. Its primary role is to synchronize time for the domain and replicate group policy and account lockout and password changes. That's it. Those are all important things, and if your PDC emulator, whatever server is holding that role, goes offline, you're probably not going to log in. You're probably not going to get any time synchronization, and since Active Directory is dependent on all the servers having the same time to ensure that there's no corruption in the Active Directory database, you're pretty much sunk without that. Usually the PDC emulator role sits along with 2 other roles on your primary domain controller in your domain. So then we go on to another role, the RID master, or the relative ID master, which is completely ambiguous and never make any sense at all as to why they named it that, but its function really is to just make sure that when something new gets added to the Active Directory database, it could be a user or a computer, whatever, that the security identifier that's been created for that gets matched up with a relative ID or a relative identifier that comes from a pool that the relative ID master server provides. It takes that RID and matches it with the secure identifier, a SID, and that makes a completely unique object in Active Directory. So it's an object that isn't duplicated, that will look like no other. You could have 2 identical servers. If you can get away with it, you can name them the same in that, but they're going to have completely different RIDs and SIDs makeups. That's it. So that's really its only function. It's pretty important, but you know, if that role on whatever server is hosting it happens to go away, or the server goes away that's hosting it rather, then what you're going to be left with is a network that isn't going to allow any additions of users or computers or anything else to AD, because it's not going to be able to perform the function of matching those 2 values. So it's pretty important. The third one you're most likely to see, and the one that's in the group of 3 that's most likely to live on the same server, Infrastructure Master. That is even more ambiguous. Its role and function is, well, let's see. Okay, it's real simple. Its only purpose is to make sure that if, say, somebody logs into your domain and they have an account in another domain, that your enterprise recognizes that their information stays correct, doesn't get corrupted, and gets applied correctly in the context of your domain. So say you added a user from another domain to a share or a service or something like that in your domain, the infrastructure master is going to make sure that any changes that happen to that account, say somebody gets a right or loses a right, or gets permission or loses permission, gets translated and copied over into what that user's rights are in your domain. That's its purpose. That's it. And in fact, in Server 2012, you can find those roles, and you can actually set those roles in the same old places. Like say we want to find where are our relative ID masters, infrastructure masters, and PDC emulator roles. Then we go to Active Directory, users and computers, go to all tasks like I'm doing here, go to operations masters, boom, there they are. You see, there's your relative ID, tells you where it is. You can change it if you want. There's the primary PDC emulator, primary domain controller emulator. And there's the infrastructure. These three are usually on the same box. That's kind of a default setting. So that's where you find those. Active Directory users and computers. Right click on the top bar there in the pane, the left pane, all tasks, operations masters. There you go. Just like Windows 2003. Now the next role, again, the next thing that whatever server you have is configured to do that we have to concern ourselves with is basically in a new group. Those first three that I just showed you, the PDC emulator, infrastructure master, and relative ID master, are called domain level roles. What that means is they only apply to the domain that you're currently working in. Remember that Active Directory has the whole concept of scalability at its heart. The whole root, tree, leaf structure, that kind of thing. Well, what it comes down to is those three are only going to operate within the domain. Say you have a domain called test.com. That's great. Test.com is the root of your forest. It is the central, the number one, the first thing you ever made in Active Directory. Well, say you want to add a new domain onto that root. Well, then say your new domain is box.com. Well, then your new domain under that root would be box.test.com. It's a subdomain. It is a domain under that root. Well, the relative ID master, the infrastructure master, and the PDC emulator, those roles are only going to function on box.test.com. They're not going to function on test.com at the top of the tree. That's where they operate. But there's two roles left in FSMO that can operate at the top of that tree. And the first one, which is probably one that's going to be the most, well, I wouldn't say the most critical, but probably more important than the last one I'll mention, is this domain naming master. Now, what the domain naming master does, so let's say you don't want the domain to be called box.test.com anymore. Maybe you want it to be called square.test.com. That change is going to have to be processed by the domain naming master. Now that role is generally held by the first domain controller, what's called the forest root domain controller, sitting at the top of the forest. Other than nasty things happening for it being offline, if that role isn't functioning, no changes are going to be able to be made to any naming in the domain. This could be problematic if you happen to add and remove a lot of domains or change names a lot. It's kind of risky to do that anyway, but Microsoft does have a whole procedure about changing domain names. Which leads to the final role. The final role is called the Schema Master. Yeah, you DBAs picked right up. Active Directory is a database. Databases use schema to basically lay out how things are organized. You know, primary keys and secondary keys and all that stuff. Well, the Schema Master doesn't change a whole lot, but it sits at the top of the tree as well. And what it does is it basically allows any changes made to the Active Directory database to be processed and then copied down to all the other domain controllers in the Active Directory tree. If something's wrong with the Schema Master, chances are your Active Directory database is corrupted and you might as well just start over, which isn't a good thing if you happen to have a large Active Directory organization. Now we've been talking about the domain level and enterprise level FSMO roles, and kind of gave you a peek as to how to get to them. When you're looking at the forest level or enterprise level roles for Active Directory, you have to go about a little differently. They're not as easy to find. For example, the Schema Master, you'll actually have to open the Microsoft Management Console and actually add the snap-in for Schema Master or Schema Management into that, save it, and then make a shortcut. I have it already opened here, but you see, once we open the MMC and we have our Schema Management root running, our application running here, okay, then we can actually do something about, see, once we select it, we can do something about actually changing the role if we want to. So we have right-click on this Active Directory schema, click Operations Manager, and you can see here we can change or just view who the Schema Master is. If we want to see who the Domain Naming Master is, we open up Active Directory Domains and Trusts. Again, select this top here, Operations Manager or Master, and here you can see the Domain Naming Master, and again, the same dialog. We can just view or change it from here. Little different from the domain level. They purposely do that because they really don't want you messing with that too much, because that affects everything you do, everything with the domain, everything to do with Active Directory in the domain, domain-wide, enterprise-wide, which means, yeah, the office in Phoenix, Tokyo, Boston, you know, wherever, they're all affected by anything you do there. So they purposely make it a little tougher to find. But just wanted to let you know how to get to those, because those are the two functions that always seem to be the hardest. The others are available through Active Directory users and computers, and that's, you know, pretty easy to find, but these aren't. So that's pretty much, that's the roles in the what would be the classic sense of an Active Directory server role. A server role is basically a definition of the role, the functionality, the responsibility for performing whatever task the server is being requested to do on behalf of Active Directory. So that makes sense. This is probably nothing new to you. You know, if you spent any time with Active Directory, you know what these roles are all about. But here's where we come into my little conversation with my friend today, with his question of what's a role and a feature. So we have our server selection. Let's close this. We have our server selection, and here we see our roles. Now remember, a role is basically just a set of tasks, a set of services, a set of features, a set of programs, however you look at it. Think of it as a grouping. Think of it as what you're assigning, a specific task you want that server to perform, not necessarily exclusively, but to be its primary area of responsibility. Say I choose application server, and I choose next here. Then we're going to do that. You see it drops down and it says features. And it says, okay, what features do I want to do or use to have this application role? I could have all these roles. I could have a feature of bits included, BitLocker, failover clustering, enhanced storage, whatever I want. So, you know, if I want a 3.5, now I don't want 3.5. And I say, okay, well, once I've picked my features, then I would go ahead and click next, and you see it drops me down to this dialog here. This is okay. Let me hit next, and it goes to the role services, and it says, okay, you've picked the kind of features you want, you've picked the role you want, you've picked the features you want to apply to that role. Okay, now we say, okay, this is the role. We've done these other prerequisites. What services do you want to offer underneath the role of an application server? See this? Select the role services to install for application server. So let's say, I really don't like any of these. Now let's say we just pick one and then click next. And then we see that right now automatically we're going to have .NET Framework 4.5. That would install if we went ahead and said and clicked install and probably would reboot. And when it came back up, we would have the role now of an application server with the .NET Framework 4.5 there as one of the features of its role. So we won't do that now, but what we're going to go ahead and do is see if we can actually take a look at what roles we do have installed here. And here we go. If we scroll down, we see we have 5 roles. We have because we're domain controller, we have the Active Directory directory services. We have the role of the DNS server. We have the role of file and storage services. We have the role of a Hyper-V server, the role of a web server, IS, and of course that's pretty much it. Local server is that's just a management app. But so you can see that this server's already got some roles installed, and this one's specific to this server. And we could also go here and look at these roles as well and manage from here. Like here's AD, and there's DNS and Hyper-V. See, our roles are here. But here's the thing, you see these are roles. Now notice, like I've switched to the file and storage services. Okay, that is an all-encompassing container. Underneath that, we can do other things. We have other little programs here. This is kind of grouped under what's related to file and storage. Well, these programs and these features. For example, I don't think I had, yeah, I don't, as a matter of fact. It's showing iSCSI, but you see I haven't installed the iSCSI feature for this particular role in file and storage services. And that's the big difference. Is features, it's pretty, you can almost equate features with programs and roles with identity. The identity of the server. I am a file server, I am an application server, I am a web server, whatever. That's the big difference between roles and services. Where it gets stupid is when somebody asks you, say in the context of an interview, give me 2 roles and 2 features. Okay, that falls into the area of a certification test, a certification exam, and honestly, if you've got any experience with Windows administration and you can explain roles and services just like I did here, nobody should be asking you exam questions. So understand the function, understand the use, understand that, again, I just showed that Microsoft has overloaded a term. It has used the term role to mean not only what's happening for Active Directory and what role again, see, I used the word role, that your server is performing, but in Active Directory, but also in another context, the role of the job your server does. And beneath that job, you can think of features as a subordinate entity to a role. Because you really, without features, a role is kind of useless. It's just a label. You need to have features to be able to leverage a role. Well, okay, so if you haven't fallen asleep yet, thank you. I appreciate your attention. That's pretty much it. I know this wasn't too exciting, but hopefully you have a little better idea of what's going on with FSMO roles and AD roles. And hopefully you also have a better idea of the difference between a role and a feature. So if you end up going on some interview somewhere and someone asks you a stupid question, just think back to this video and, you know, you can tell them that. If they start asking about enumerating, give me 10 features, well, I just suggest you leave, but that's me. Hey, thanks for watching. I appreciate your patience and your attention, and have a great one. I'm out.